Hi, I'm Mia Parrish in Devils in the Details, and this week we're talking to Ed Maguire. He's an expert in police use of force, particularly in protests and conflicts, which we are seeing throughout the summer and into the fall. He has done quite a lot of work on proposed reforms for U.S. police departments as well. And I'm really interested to hear, Ed, in the context that we're in right now, what makes for a good protest? What is a good protest? Protests are a part of the American fabric. It's a really important part of who we are. We're sort of founded on that principle of being able to protest. What is a model for success?
Well, I think, in a democracy, it's really important that we value people's right to assemble and to speak freely, and in particular against the government when they feel the need to do so. And it's really important that we protect their right to do that. And so on the policing side, we need to facilitate peaceful protest. And on the protest side, we need to remain peaceful and law-abiding.
So what do you see as law enforcement's role when policing protests? There's been a lot of controversy around what this looks like.
Yeah, I think it's really important for police to understand the First Amendment and the protections that it provides the American people. And I think it's really important for police to facilitate peaceful protest. But I also think it's important for police to protect public safety and their own safety. And so when people start to be violent toward one another or to be violent toward the police, then the police need to invoke the criminal justice process. They need to make arrests and prosecutors need to prosecute. And so it's a double-edged sword here. We're trying to facilitate peaceful First Amendment expression while also holding people accountable for illegal and particularly violent and destructive behavior.
Right. What do you think has gone right in some of the recent protests across the nation?
I think when protesters make the decision to behave peacefully and behave in a law-abiding manner, not to engage in property damage and fire setting and violence, I think that's when protests are going right. And the vast majority of protests are peaceful. Unfortunately, the ones we see, covered in social media and in the conventional news media are the ones where they go wrong. But most protests are peaceful. And we need to encourage peaceful and lawful protest.
What do you think has gone wrong?
What goes wrong is when the police, when a handful of people in the crowd start to engage in violent or destructive behavior and the police take enforcement action against entire crowds. And so this could be mass arrests. It could be firing tear gas at entire crowds, many of whom haven't done anything wrong. Or firing less lethal munitions, pepper balls and rubber bullets and other types of munitions at entire crowds. That's where we start to not only get injuries, but where we also get people who are really angry that they were essentially assaulted by the police when they haven't violated any law.
Which is a reasonable response.
I think so.
What do you think is the most appropriate response in these types of events? Speaking of appropriate response.
Right. So what we typically advise police to do is not to look at a crowd as homogeneous, but to think of a crowd as heterogeneous. You've got people in the crowd who are engaging in peaceful and lawful behavior, and we need to facilitate their ability to do so under the First Amendment. And when we have people in the crowd who are engaging in violent or destructive behavior, we need to make arrests. We need to take those people out of the crowd situation. And so the hard part here is adopting sort of the double response, right? The twin response. So on one hand, we're facilitating peaceful First Amendment expression. And on the other hand, we're making very targeted arrests of people who are engaging in inappropriate behavior.
All right. How do arrests and or citations impact protests and activists, do you think?
Well, it depends on the type of arrest. And so, within some of the social justice communities in our country, it's conceived of as a badge of honor to be arrested. And as long as the arrest is for a fairly minor offense like disorderly conduct or something like, a curfew violation, something like that. However, when we have people engaging in what we're seeing right now, for instance, is a lot of fire setting. Arson is a felony in the United States, which can come with
Mhm.
some serious prison time. So I don't think any protesters are typically eager to engage in felonious behavior and be held accountable for it.
Could you talk about acts of violence during counter protests and what law enforcement should be doing to ensure safety between protesters?
Yeah, so the typical, approach and the appropriate approach is to separate protesters from counter protesters, particularly in the current climate where I think there's a high likelihood of violence, and we're seeing some of that violence in Kenosha and in Portland and elsewhere. And so, police need definitely to separate the different factions, particularly when they receive intelligence that there may be violence. And we learned this lesson on, the hard way in Charlottesville, where the two sides were allowed to mingle and engage in pretty serious violence against one another. In Portland recently, the police took a kind of a hands-off approach, allowing the two sides to mingle. And it was a really inappropriate response to having two sides that are so likely to be violent against one another. And so we should learn the lesson from Charlottesville, and even, to a lesser extent from the recent violence in Portland, and make sure we keep the two sides separated.
So you've written about the escalated force model and how it has been used to police protests in the 60s and 70s. Can you explain what that means and what history has taught us, as you were talking about?
Right. What a great question. And so, in the 1960s, the dominant approach to handling protests was what's been called the escalated force model. And the idea is very simple. If the police continue to use, greater and greater levels of force, then at some point the protesters will relent and go home. Right. And so the idea is that if the police keep escalating force, it will deter protesters. And unfortunately, we know that that's simply not true. And in fact, what we know from crowd psychology is it can often have the opposite effect of escalating conflict, escalating violence, and producing unintended consequences. The problem that's happening right now in this country is that there are some police leaders and some police agencies who continue to cling to that outmoded philosophy of how to handle protests. And so what we typically are advising police agencies to do is to think about their strategy as having two components. The one component is the typical law enforcement response, right? Making arrests, but in a very targeted way when people need to be arrested. But the other piece is what we're often missing, and that's a massive communication campaign, lots of de-escalation, lots of one-on-one out there communicating with the protest community and attempting to win hearts and minds so that those same people aren't then so willing to throw rocks and bottles and other harmful objects at the police.
Right. And the protesting that's going on here is not isolated to the United States. Both around social justice and human rights. How does it compare what's going on here with protests in Hong Kong or other parts of the world? And what can we learn from them?
Well, unfortunately, protests are a reality of life around the world. And in some Latin American countries, for instance, police are firing lethal rounds at protesters. There are very disturbing videos on YouTube of people engaging in peaceful protest activity who are being murdered by police in Latin America. That's really unfortunate. We have in Chile, which is typically considered a model of democracy in Latin America, we saw more than 400 people receive serious eye injuries when police were shooting impact munitions at them, rubber bullets and pepper balls and so forth. And, so you have a lot of people in Chile who have lost their eyesight in one eye or who have received very serious eye injuries. In Hong Kong, the response of the police has just been dreadful, and we've seen, unfortunately, the police repression in Hong Kong, sort of lead into a pretty dramatic loss of freedoms for the people in Hong Kong. And so, in the United States, we're not seeing that level of repression. We are certainly seeing unconstitutional behavior in some communities. We're certainly seeing police violence where it's inappropriate in certain communities, but we're not seeing it at that same level that we've seen in Chile or that we're seeing in Belarus or Hong Kong or these other settings where the police response has been just overtly violent.
I think you're seeing a lot of increase in the violence or increase in protesting with social media and the effect of that, with like Arab Spring and others, sometimes positively and oftentimes negatively. What do you think the technology effects are, and what do you think protests will look like in the future? How are they trending?
So we know that people are highly affected by vicarious contact with police via social media. Unfortunately, this is not particularly well studied in the protest aspect of police relationships with communities. And so this is an area of research that we need to study. We know more generally, for instance, that when we see, police use of deadly force or, traffic stops gone bad or other types of encounters go bad, there is research evidence on how those vicarious contacts with police can really have dramatic effects on people's perceptions of police. But we really don't know much about that topic within the specific context of protests. And so the research community, me included, we've got lots of work to do to try to understand more about that.
Ed, could you tell us more about the research coming out of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice in regard to this issue?
Yeah, so our goal is to become, one of the national and even international leaders in the police response to protests. This is an ongoing issue, and we're continuing to do research on it. We're studying, for instance, right now, the response of the Portland police and the various arrests that they've made, tracking those cases through prosecution and so forth. We'll be doing the same thing in Kenosha, and we're just about to kick off a program of research with the Phoenix police on how they're handling these issues. And then on an ongoing basis, we're tracking police response to protests internationally. So studying in particular the response of police in Chile, which has had a long string of protests over the last year or so, and also in Hong Kong. And we'll be working with the Inter-American Development Bank to try to study the police response to protests in Latin America and the Caribbean. And that's just some of what we've got going on right now with regard to the police response to protests.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Ed Maguire from the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, for joining us on Devils in the Details. This topic is so interesting and so relevant, and I really appreciate all you're doing and for joining us on Devils in the Details today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.